How we're changing the infrastructure of the places that we live. It's a really cool panel with the likes of Uber, TfL, Drivy, and Citymapper. And our host for the panel, who will introduce our panelists, is of course Prashant Rao, who's the global editor of The Atlantic. Round of applause, please, and over to you, Prashant.
Folks. Can everyone hear us okay? So we're going to get right to it. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to quickly outline some of the general things happening in the world of urban transport and tell you why we're not going to talk about them. And then I'll introduce all of these amazing panelists, and then we'll get into some really cool conversations. So as was said, my name is Prashant Rao. I'm the international editor of The Atlantic, which is, I hope you all know, a international magazine that talks about tech, culture, politics, and international affairs. But today, we're talking transport, particularly in London. It goes without saying, of course, that London is a huge market for a lot of the companies that are here, if not the biggest market. But also, it is a leader in terms of how other cities regulate their transport infrastructure. It is a model for how other cities think about public transport and how people interact with traffic, getting to work, their commutes, all of these things. So let me just go through the panelists really quickly, and then we'll start our conversation. So first on my left is Omid. Omid is the president and head of business at Citymapper and a business advisor to Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. You were previously at Foursquare Europe and Google, working on business development and strategic partnerships.
Correct.
Cool. Michael is the director of transport innovation at Transport for London, TfL. He and his team look for new ideas and developments around the world to see what kind of stuff would work here in London, what is worthwhile, what business models, what new technologies, what new developments could be brought here that would work well, and how transport gets better in the future. Then Eugenie. Sorry, I think I screwed up. Is the head of cities at Uber, so she focuses on building partnerships with officials, organizations in the south, the west, and the east of England. She is a CLOR Social Leadership Fellow and the former chief executive of the educational charity, the Goodall Foundation. And then finally, Katy, to the far left, is the UK head of Drivy, which is Europe's largest car-sharing service. She's told us off stage that you won't need to remember the name because it's soon going to be called Get Around, which is the company that acquired Drivy earlier this year. And before that, she was the global marketing director at Juicy, is that right?
Got it, yeah.
Which is New Zealand's largest car and camper van rental company. So there are a few basic things that we talked about beforehand, just to sort of summarize quickly so we can get to the really interesting stuff. There are 3 or 4 major things that are driving transport and how transport is changing, particularly in the urban world. We all think about electrification, cars running on electric motors and stuff. Automation, increasingly that will be interesting as time goes on, and the declining ownership of vehicles by individuals. So, the likes of Drivy and Uber play a role in this, but we're kind of not going to talk about any of that because we're going to assume you know enough now. So let's start with some really interesting big picture questions about transport. And one of the things we've been thinking about is the role that, how does an organization like TfL work in the transport infrastructure? Is your instinct to sort of stand back and let everything kind of work, or do you feel like you need to be more in the space and kind of intervening in that way?
Well, the basic principle is you intervene where there's a market failure. So everything is underpinned by a vision for the city, vision for healthy streets, really doubling down on how much sustainable transport people make and take around the city, cycling, walking, public transit. So you're always going to have to invest on that. And the question is, for everything else that comes, there's a great version of it and a less good version of it. So we like it. We like any new business model if it's going to encourage an efficient use of the city or improve environmental performance or remain accessible for everybody, not just your affluent, tech-savvy hipster. It's got to work for the people who are less able-bodied or the 15% of people who don't have a mobile phone in London for whatever reason. So we've got to make sure it's for equitable use, equal opportunity. And I think if you're failing on those, that's the argument for intervening.
Omid, do you agree with that? I mean, I feel like Citymapper probably has a different view of what the government should be doing.
Of course. No, I know Michael well, and I always give him a hard time about these things. I would say, from my perspective, there are a couple of things. One, and I think Michael was talking about market failure. I feel like externalities are not necessarily treated well if the market is left to its own devices. What do I mean by that is air quality is not necessarily something everybody cares about as an individual player, or for instance, the road usage, congestion, all those things. So I think a regulator certainly has to take care of those things because nobody else really cares about it as much. Two, and this is one where I would like to urge you to maybe step up a little bit, is creating more sandboxes for innovators to actually experiment with things. And I know there are things that are happening. I think there should be more space for people who have ideas to do things. The great thing that the FCA did with fintech was it created this fintech sandbox where a lot of these innovators came and made us basically a fintech capital. I think we can do the same with mobility, and a lot of stuff is happening, but not enough in my view. And I think that's always going to be the issue. I want to have more things faster rather than what's happening with regulators. Another thing I would say is get out of the way. That's one of the things that I would highlight. And last but not least, and I think this is really an important one, if something is aligned with the mayor's transport strategy here specifically, or in general, and with the goals of as a smarter city that we want to see in the future, I think regulators have to actually be really encouraging and pushing those things. And I've seen less of that because it always comes down to, oh, we can't play favorites. Well, if something is actually in favor of the city of the future as we see it, it's okay to be a little bit favoritist.
We said nice things about your app, about the card.
You did after like 5 years.
Dude, it takes a while, right? You know, like we wouldn't have said that when we first started, right?
That's true.
And we get there.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point. By the way, we do know each other well, and we are friends, but we have some really good professional arguments.
Yes.
And by the way, they never give us any data or insight back. Just saying.
We'll get to that.
But I think that's the point, and it's getting that balance right, because I think we both know we push it. The inherent tension you have is that what feels like lightning moves for a public authority feels like,
eons.
Yeah, it's like a super tanker in your world.
Correct.
I mean, well, one of the things you talked about just then is data, right? So this is something that I think everyone is talking about all the time, thinking about, how is our data being used? Who owns it? Where is it going? And I'm curious then that, particularly from TfL's point of view, TfL's been pretty open to allowing its data to be accessed by companies like Citymapper and others to figure out new services, new platforms. Is there anything to that model that maybe TfL has to start charging for some of this like really advanced stuff, the really kind of internal data, or ask of more data from the companies that are sort of collecting it, like Uber and others and Citymapper?
So we do a lot of stuff on open data. We got 71 APIs and 11,000 people registered, and 700 apps developed. Some of them are really useful, and we only don't do it if we think there is a security reason or a commercial reason or a privacy reason not to. That's the general rule of thumb. I think it's a big step to start commercializing that. We know from a lot of work with our customers that they rely on us and trust us to be a neutral transactor of information and data. So I think it's a big step to start moving into commercializing it. However, where it is useful is where you can have providing better insight about where people move around the network. So we're doing that right now on the tube, managing about tracking people through their Wi-Fi usage through tube stations so we can improve information or station design. Similarly, we do data partnerships. So one of the most famous ones is in our control room, we have a data partnership with Waze, right? So we can push out messages about where the road closures are, what people need to do or avoid or behave in certain different ways on the roads, which has really worked. One really quick example, Blackwall Tunnel going under London. One of the real issues there is people running out of fuel, running out of gas in the tunnel. So we have a non-monetary kind of agreement with Waze where we share information that's mutually beneficial. So we got them to push information out to people routed through the tunnel. So have you remembered to fill up? Here's the nearest petrol gas stations. And that led to a reduction in the number of people running out of juice under the tunnel. Right. So there's partnership approaches. I think it's a really big step to start commercializing it.
Right, but do you think that, for example, like what kind of data would Drivy and Uber be comfortable providing to TfL? What kind of data do you already provide to TfL? And in the future, what do you think you could be doing?
Sure. So Uber already is sort of in line with TfL and many others who are open to sharing data. We have something called Uber Movement, which is available for lots of our large cities globally, where you can actually just go onto the website and you can see aggregated, anonymized data on Uber trips in and around a city. And we actually recently launched speed information as well, so you can actually see how fast or slow the traffic is moving based on the Uber data that's available. So really keen on that. And I actually think that TfL and others who have been able to share their data openly for quite a long time have really helped create those sandboxes of innovation that Omid was speaking to, because that is what enables other organizations, companies, to go in and think about how to make that best as a whole experience for a customer, for somebody who's traveling from A to B, and to help join those dots together. So very keen on open data, super excited about what TfL has shared and is sharing, and very keen for us. We're just about to launch our data in Bristol, but we do it for Birmingham, Manchester, here in London, and a couple of the big cities in the UK as well.
From our point of view, as a relatively new player in the UK market, we don't share data with TfL yet. But our policy across all of our markets has always been the same, that we're open and happy to doing so. We're happy to share information about where our supply of cars is located, the pricing of those, the availability of those. From our point of view, anything that lets users know about the availability of mobility options in their areas is in the end going to get them more into any of our services. So pretty open to it. For us, where a bigger challenge really comes along is not the sharing of data, but more the integration into city mass platforms and so forth. Because you consider from our point of view, obviously, what we're allowing you guys to do is to rent out your car to other people. Security, safety, trust, risk is a huge component here. So what we're always trying to do is the platform that we've built for booking and payment, that's what we've spent most of our engineering work over the last few years. So to integrate into a third-party platform opens up quite a lot of risk options there. So we're more cautious on the integration than on the data side, certainly.
Can I add to that as well?
Go ahead, yeah.
I'll try not to jump up and start dancing, though. So I want to kind of clarify one thing. We always say, like, data. It's actually, we're after insights, right? Because I think a lot of organizations have tons of data, and I'm sure a lot of cities in the world, as well as TfL, has tons of data. And I can open up all my data. Well, we can talk about that. But it's not going to be useful if you don't derive insights out of it. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I want to make, there's factual data, there's personal data, and there's behavioral data. And I'd say factual data is essentially taxpayer-owned. What we're basically doing is we're financing with taxpayer money, TfL, and public bodies, and those factual data sources should be public to anybody to use, in my mind, developers alike, to actually build on those platforms and create value that would otherwise not exist. Hopefully, we have proven that with open data, which London and TfL pioneered. And hopefully, it's also saved London a lot of money because the app is for free. Now, on personal data, well, that should be owned by everybody individually, frankly, and that's what it is, also legally speaking, in this country. Thirdly, behavioral data, and I think on that front, there's obviously an argument to be made that aggregate anonymized data has really interesting insights that could help cities to do better planning, to derive kind of understanding of where things are failing or things are not working really well. And on that side, we've always spoke to most cities and said, hey, look, we'd love to have a conversation about this stuff. How should we do this? And most of the time, haven't really seen that much pull, one. Two, I haven't seen pragmatism, right? I mean, it's not really fair to say, hey, give us all your data. That's not really a pragmatic approach. I can't employ 20 extra people just to give you all the data. Or then there's standards like the ODBL license in Central Europe that really doesn't specify exactly what you have to share back, but you have to share something back, and it's not clear in which format. So I think there's a long way to come, and usually people point fingers to the private sector for not doing things, but I also think it's really, on both sides, something that we need to figure out. And I would like to ask you directly, Michael, I think you have more data at TfL than you can even use right now. So I'm not sure if my data is going to really help you that much, but we can have a debate on that.
Yeah. we have this debate, and I say, can you tell us about origin and destination data? And he goes, no.
No,
That's,
we can
that's
have
for our
that
business. Yeah. So no, but I think that's the point, and it's where you draw the line.
Right.
You know, so for a city planner, right, what you need to know is where are the flows of people, where is the pressure on the network, where is the crowding, where you're creating the safety issues, where do you need to open up economic opportunities, and the gold dust for a city planner is origin and destination. And because that's right on the cusp of personal versus insight, or personal versus behavioural, then it becomes sensitive. But that for us is the key request, and we'll keep talking about it.
Can I belabor this one more time? Sorry. So
Only one.
Okay. What we did really well in London was open data. What we see in Singapore is they, for instance, have crowdedness information now that they're publicizing, right? I just want us to stay at the head of the curve when it comes to innovation in terms of open data, and I'm very happy to see that we're doing stuff with Wi-Fi data there. I think we have to do more. I think people should be able to give the license out or give permission to let companies access their Oyster data if they want to, and all these other kind of data sources should be available for companies with the consent of the user, essentially to use, because we're going to build interesting insights and hopefully valuable consumer propositions on top. And I'd rather us leading the way than being complacent because we did open data first.
10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
Sure.
On that subject, though, of sort of commercializing the data, I mean, you talked a little bit about this earlier. How do we ensure? I mean, London has a lot of parts of London that are extremely commercially lucrative, and some parts of London that are not as commercially lucrative. And you talked about equitability and equal access. How do you ensure that companies like Citymapper, like Uber, and others have to, continue to provide services or continue to offer services across the city? I mean, what does that look like in terms of asking that or making sure that happens?
And that's really tough. And it's that kind of argument that means that you end up often with subsidized services. It's London that specifies the bus network, and there are that is a subsidized service overall, right? And there are some extremely unprofitable bus routes. That's one of the reasons why we're trialing demand-responsive buses right now. It's not because we think we can make loads and loads of money out of it. The question is, can we provide a great customer service with less or equal to the subsidy that we currently provide? And so, because for equity, that is why, because there is a social interest, you are encouraged to intervene in the market. The challenge for us as TfL now, particularly as we are completely independent of funding for operations from central government, we've got to make sure that the profitable services are enough and give enough revenue to fund everything. So we've got to make sure that it all adds up. But I think that's one of the key issues. I mean, if you just taking it wider than London, if you look at what micromobility, very hot topic. The way LA, for example, are giving out their permits, it costs one price if you're operating the permits in the busy parts of town or the affluent parts of town or down by the coast. It costs you less if you're operating in areas of requiring economic development. So there are tunes you can play as a regulator, as a permitter, as a specifier to encourage that the market works in that way. But it is tough. At the end of the day, there's commercial decisions, and you see what happened with like Mobike in London. They started out with agreements with all sorts of boroughs, realised it wasn't making enough money, and they're just focusing on profitable routes. And so that's one of those challenges about what's the right balance. You don't want to intervene too much, but you need to intervene to make sure that it says transport that works for all.
Sure. Now, I'm conscious that we've got two companies here that ostensibly are based around the car, and TfL is fairly publicly anti-car. Is that fair to say?
Well, we want people to go on sustainable modes. I prefer
You can't
people
say it.
So he's agreeing with me.
Well, look, let's put it this way, right? So our transport strategy is aiming to get 80% of private trips on sustainable modes by 2041. That's cycling, walking, public transport.
Right.
If we succeed to do that, and it's a challenge, but we will try, that's still over 1.2 billion car trips a year in London, right? So these guys have a role to play.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is what I was going to ask you. I mean, what is the case for the car in the modern urban world? If we're, being encouraged to use the tube, the bus, bicycles, e-scooters, all of these things, what role does the car have to play?
I know that it's counterintuitive being the head of a car-sharing company, but I would also classify myself as anti-car. So maybe not so specifically anti-car as to anti-private car ownership. When you look at that on a city level, on an environmental level, on a social level, but even on an individual economic level, it doesn't make sense. So we have, on average, a car is costing people $3.5 grand a year to run by the time you have the insurance, the costs. And stats from the RAC show that each car is sitting there completely unutilized, sleeping for 96% of the time. When you look at that on an individual use case, it's madness. And then what that's also encouraging people to do when they have a car is actually use that car. Humans are inherently lazy. If we've got a hunk of metal sitting in the driveway, we're going to use that to go to the shops, especially when you consider the amount of money we've spent on it. We want to justify its existence. If people don't privately own that car, but instead share that car, they don't have it as an automatic go-to, because there still is a use case for cars. People will still want, every now and again, to take the kids to, I don't have kids, Chessington World Adventures, not sure. Take your friends to Glastonbury. There you go. There still is a use case for it. And for those occasions, until you give people a true alternative to owning a car, i.e. car sharing, they'll continue to use it. And we've got a lot of stats to say that our users have given up their car and opted to use car sharing instead. And also the French Ministry for Environment's got a study to show that people who do car share, travel 41% less kilometers by car each day. So I think the part that we can all play is getting people to reconsider, is the use of the car for that particular journey at that particular time the right one? Because most of the time there is an alternative, but until we create an alternative to car ownership, people will continue to use it by default autopilot.
Yeah, I would fully agree and echo all that you've said. I think that the car needs to be considered as one of many modes in a broad mix, that we're not all going to be wedded to our car 365 days a year, but we do need to find viable alternatives. And if cars are shared and also if they're sustainable, then there's a real role for them to play in the future. There might just be far fewer of them running on electric miles rather than chugging out bad air into the world. So that's definitely something that we're going for. And sort of in London in particular, there are two things we're doing with that. One with the Uber pool, which is getting more people together into cars to make their journeys. And the second thing is something that we launched earlier this year called the Clean Air Fund, which is trying to get every single car that is on the Uber platform to be fully electric by 2025. So that is something that's really exciting, so that for those who need to use a car for whatever reason, and it might be for accessibility reasons or anything else, that is still an option there, but it's one that has a long-term benefit for kind of the broader city good at the same time.
Cool. So we're just about out of time. So this is a thing that we talked about a little while ago, but I'm curious, just to bring it back to our day-to-day lives and how our lives are going to change, getting us away from investments and the future of the car and all this kind of thing. I'm curious, how did you get here today? And how do you think that would change in, let's say, 5 years, and then, let's say, 25 years? So in the short term, and then in the slightly longer term. So, Omid, do you want to start?
Sure. I used Citymapper, obviously, and I took the tube. I had to.
Other services are available.
yes, which are not as good. But I think in 5 years' time, what's going to happen is, I think we're seeing the first version of the light electrified vehicles, and I think I don't have the creativity to envision what the equivalent of what the Nokia 6190 is to like this iPhone 10 that I have in my pocket, of that kind of mode will look like. And I think we'll see like probably a lot more of these individualized scooter thingies of the future. In 5 years' time, I'm probably going to move out of London because I want to buy something which I can barely afford there. And then I'm going to take one of those things to a rail station, take the train into town, and then walk the last mile, or maybe take a cab depending on the rain or not. And I will do that covered by Citymapper Pass, which is a subscription for transport that covers cabs, bikes, and public transport, which you should all look into. It's in the app.
Sorry, the company you work for is...
Citymapper.
Oh, right, I didn't catch that. I forgot. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I use Google Maps.
You had to do it. You had to do it.
No,
You could have said Uber, public transport.
Yeah. So I used that. I actually got the overground. And well, who knows? Hopefully soon, maybe going east to west, we can get the Elizabeth line. Fingers crossed, as soon as we can. No, but for me, I actually agree with you, Omid. But what I would say, one thing that for me I think is It's getting to that point. There's things that we know about the future in transport in London and things that we still don't know. So, the classic is, more public transport we're going to do. That's going to still be there in 5 years. There's certain things that are further away. Autonomous vehicles, drones, urban air mobility, right? There's some stuff that is now shifting into the mainstream where we're getting the tipping point where the economics are looking right. So I would say by 2025, I think this much more ubiquitous, deliverable electrification of the transport on the roads will be with us. And I think the one thing that we're going to see that maybe when I'm getting here, I will walk past some kind of mobility hub, which will be a combined solution for where you can do rapid charging for vehicles, maybe servicing with those vehicles, maybe combined with some early trials of micro consolidation of freight where you don't have the delivery trucks doing the last mile circulation. You transfer onto e-bikes or e-cargo bikes or something like that. So I would say that real driving electrification and this kind of hub model where it's really tough to make individual business models if you're thinking about infrastructure and access to land. But if you treat land as a platform, access to the land, the space you make available, then you can combine a whole series of sustainable transport ideas into one space.
That's super interesting. So I don't live in London. I live in Brighton. So it was walking, train, tube, walk, and a little bit more walking to get here today, which I guess is in and of itself kind of living the sort of the Uber line of wanting to replace your car with your phone, because there are various different apps that I use to sort of make all of that happen. In 5 years' time, I would love there to be a bullet train that's 30 minutes with perfect Wi-Fi that gets from Brighton to London. And then in 25 years' time, there are flying taxis, as they're called, that may well be coming over the skies of London and elsewhere in the UK. Or maybe we're all going to be hologrammed into events like these, and I can just stay in Brighton and be right by the sea. But I think actually to an earlier point around kind of equity of transport and provision, actually those who are in city centres, like we are well served, and we are going to continue to be well served in the medium and long term. And it is really thinking about how do we support those who live on the outer boroughs or who don't live in the city at all to make sure that it is as easy and seamless for them to get into an event like this as it is for those who are only just a handful of miles away. And that's actually one of the reasons why I was super interested in joining Uber, is thinking that there's a really strong story to tell that's already been shown on how it can help fill some of those transport deserts in city centres and in those suburban areas and areas of kind of higher need, and how we can do more of that. So it's not just me being able to come in and talk about this with my stick in 25 years' time, but many, many more people as well.
Katy?
Me, this morning, the boys did their own plug, so I'm going to do yours. I walked outside my house and there was a jump bike standing there. Yes! Literally right outside my house.
Amazing. I don't know your address.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Eugenie knows that I'm speaking today.
Yeah.
It's a bit weird. So I thought, you know what, treat yourself, and hopped on the bike to work. I imagine that in 5 years' time, I love active travel. It probably would not for me personally, look too dissimilar. But over the course between that 5 and 25, I'm completely with you, Omid. By then, my life will look a little bit less Glastonbury and a little bit more Chessington World Adventures. So I will probably be out somewhere in the burbs taking an automated pod to the station and then coming in. But it's interesting because you're talking about automation in the future and what's going to happen over this time. The infrastructure, it's not here yet, but the infrastructure's not here yet. But another change that needs to happen is really around consumer acceptance of it, which is all very well for us in central London, tech industry people, to be talking about our feelings of getting into an automated pod. For us, we probably are not nervous around that. We're not suspicious of it. In fact, we're probably not even that impressed, really. Whereas you think of, Aunt Mildred, Uncle Dave, these kind of things, the guys who totally glaze over when you try and tell them what you do for a living. And they're going to really find that quite an intimidating process. So when we talk about inclusion, a step is going to be familiarization with that. And that is, back to the point of the cars, getting people out of their privately owned vehicles so that they start taking baby steps towards the future.
Great. Well, I think we have run out of time, in fact, gone over time. So it leaves me to just ask you to thank our panelists for a really interesting discussion. And thank you.
Well, thanks
Thank you.
for that.
Well done.
How was the jump?
Thank you very much.